Welcome to The Forgotten, a member of Episodic Network. Season 2, Episode 8. It takes a thief to catch a thief. I am pretty sure everyone has had to deal with some kind of disappointment or abused trust in his life. There are always situations where someone you put your faith in lets you down or does not perform as asked. I like to believe that, whatever those situations may be, it tells a lot about you how you react to it. Weird opening, I know, but this time we will deal with someone who took this disappointment in the worst way possible. The government change from Hoover to Roosevelt was not exactly a smooth one. There were unpopular measures to be taken, the economy was in shambles, and the criminal behavior of the big guys at Wall Street was reaching unprecedented levels. Joe Kennedy, however, had a lot of reasons for high hopes on a position in the new government. After all, he had saved FDR's nomination by winning Hearst over, donated quite a substantial sum of money, and no one really cared where this money came from, and had in general been very active on the campaign trail. It might have been overly ambitious, but Joe hoped for a position as the Secretary of the Treasury. Joe spent the entire November of 1932 in his New York office, waiting for the call from the White House that they had a job for him. And he waited. And waited. Even the New York Times got suspicious of that, and listed him in an article called "The Cabinet Mr. Roosevelt Already Has, the group of advisors who assist him in plotting his course on political seas." Little did they know that Roosevelt did not consider him for any political office except the largely ceremonial one of Treasurer of the United States, not Secretary of the Treasury. Once again, his history with Wall Street had come back to bite him. Roosevelt's advisors did not have to do too much to dissuade Roosevelt from giving Kennedy some elevated position in the hierarchy of Washington. He still had the taint of the grand Wall Street profiteer on him. And with Roosevelt's quite liberal and, some even said, radical left positions, putting one of the malefactors in charge of the entire bunch might have been a PR nightmare. Especially as specialized courts in the US started to indict several of the big fish for their fraudulent activities. Furthermore, Kennedy had no political experiences whatsoever. This entire situation must have hit him like a fire truck. Joe, hugely disappointed, went on to confer with William Randolph Hearst and pretty much sucked up to him. In a letter from Christmas Eve 1932, he wrote, "Over a period of 20 years in business, I have had to do with great many people, big and little. In all my experience, I have never once met up with anyone who so nearly fitted my idea of a perfect business associate. My sincerest wishes for a Merry Christmas and Happy New Year, with the hope that this year I may have the opportunity to be of some service to you." Hearst, himself having hoped for some substantial position, used Kennedy as a relay to the president to hand over several memoranda, which Roosevelt did not even read or answer. Kennedy still considered holding one trump card. He was very closely affiliated with James, Jimmy Roosevelt, the president's son, as well as one of the president's senior advisors, Raymond Moley. The latter observed the situation as follows: "I heard plenty of Kennedy's execration of Roosevelt, of his criticism of the president-elect, who, according to Kennedy, had no program. There must have been hundreds of dollars in telephone calls to provide an exchange of abuse of Roosevelt between Kennedy and W.R. Hearst. But while I never developed a real affection for Kennedy, I sympathized with his disappointment." Kennedy apparently decided that if intriguing with Hearst and other entrepreneurs did not help him to get a seat in the government, outright sycophancy might do the job. After spending the winter as usual in Palm Springs, still furious of the president and outright insulting when talking to any other about him, he returned to his New York office and responded to a largely disinterested letter with no real job offer from Roosevelt with the following: "It is pleasant to any of us to know that we are remembered by those in high places. And you have made your place high, in the respect, admiration, faith and gratitude of the people you saved from despair, or worse, and high in history, for, I feel sure, your work will go on, widening in scope and results. It is not a flash in the pan, it is lasting and important. I knew you capable of that sort of thing when I first joined your forces. I have continued to think that ever since. I owe you a debt for the privilege I feel it was to have come into contact with you, and to have been of such slight aid in your battle as was in my power. I shall always look upon that period as one of the most satisfactory in my life. Well, I don't know what you guys think, but the amount of brown-nosing in this letter is beyond anything I have read in my entire life. It is needless to say that the president-elect did not respond to that letter, and it did not increase the chances of him getting a position in the cabinet anytime soon. What did improve his chances, however, was his growing friendship with the president's son, who will be of great importance in the coming tale: the post-prohibition alcohol sales. In February 1933, Congress had officially approved the 21st Amendment to the US Constitution, which repealed prohibition. It would take an undefined time to ratify this decision, and all over the states, businessmen rushed to prepare themselves for the coming battle. Kennedy, however, had an even better idea, a chapter Nassau describes brilliantly. Owens, Illinois, was a popular company which produced glass bottles. Libbey Owens Ford, a company with a somewhat similar name, did produce windshields for cars. A broker named Elisha Walker had the brilliant idea that artificially raising the volume of shares traded for the windshield company, by basically playing ping-pong with their shares, would attract the interest of traders who were actually out for the shares of the bottle company, tricking them into buying windshield shares. Kennedy joined the gang who performed this stunt together with the Lehman Brothers and Walter Chrysler. Yes, the Walter Chrysler. It worked brilliantly, and Kennedy reinvested the profits of this scam into shares of the bottle company and distilleries, tripling his investions in the process. Another stunt he performed was that he took Roosevelt Jr., a lawyer by profession, to London. He knew London's banking district from the days when he bought FBO, and had a reputation of being a brilliant businessman there. So he managed to gain several exclusive licenses for the import of Scotch and gin in fall 1933. Jimmy did not become part of this business, but instead gained the rights to insure all transport craft which were to deliver the booze to the US. When Prohibition was officially ended on December 5th, Kennedy's Somerset Imports, his new importing business, started to make revenues. In the first year, 1934, it made over $536,000 in gross profits. In 1936, it made more than $1 million. Businessman Joe Kennedy had again hit 2 home runs and increased his already substantial wealth further. But not enough. The federal government hardly saw any dollar of the revenues of Somerset Imports. Kennedy put all of them into irrevocable trusts, 9 of them for his 9 children, the youngest, Edward Moore, Ted Kennedy, being born in February 1932, which they were to access as soon as they were aged 31. As all children already had well-stocked trust funds, it is believed that Kennedy installed those to care for his grandchildren. Much of the year passed without any further events, except constant fear for John F's exploit at school, which were quite subpar, as the young man was apparently way more interested in sports than in his studies. Being set under enormous pressure from Joe and Joe Jr., whose career at Joe was at its last leg, Jack simply collapsed and was rushed into hospital. Not sure whether the immense stress or his sickly disposition caused the collapse. The doctors just could not agree on what he was suffering from, with some even diagnosing leukemia. He recovered as quickly as he had fallen ill, with the positive side effects of his parents, elder brother, and teachers turning a blind eye to his academic failures. For an unknown reason, sometime in 1933, Joe had befriended Felix Frankfurter, a professor at Harvard Law School and advisor to the Roosevelt administration, opening him another door into the White House, which might finally be the one he could enter through. Frankfurter, an Austrian Jew who had come to the US at 12 years old, was an unlikely friend for our proper Bostonian Irish Catholic, about whose opinion on Jews we'll lose a few words more in the next episode. Was very much responsible for drafting many of the bills and acts the Roosevelt administration passed, and he was more than certainly as far on the left side of politics as was acceptable back in the day. Frankfurter, most importantly, was the lead designer of the Securities Act of 1933, which forced the issuer of shares to disclose any important information about what he offered to anyone who wanted to buy it, aiming at destroying the terrible insider trading happening at Wall Street. This rampant trading caused the trust in shares to plummet even further, which kept the economy from recovering. With a majority in both houses and very loyal senators and congressmen, Roosevelt managed to push through the laws with relative ease. While Wall Street and a substantial part of the major press outlets drew horror scenarios of Roosevelt wanting to abolish money and capitalism and Frankfurter being Stalin's newest tool for spreading the world revolution, Joe Kennedy, one of the worst inside traders of them all, actually said that he agreed with 85% of it, while deeming 15% too harsh, a fact with which Frankfurter was absolutely pleased. However, the 33 Securities Act was only the tip of the spear. In early April of 1934, Joe Kennedy was called by Jimmy Roosevelt. The president was returning from a fishing trip by train and would stop in Palm Beach, where Kennedy, as always, spent the winter, and he asked whether he'd be ready to meet him. When Kennedy, of course rushing for the appointment, met the president, he was invited to the White House for the following weekend. After several late-night talks about fiscal politics with Jimmy, Joe, Roosevelt and Joe's pet rival Lewis Howe, Roosevelt told Joe that it was time to come to Washington. Still sensing that it was his reputation as one of the worst manipulators at Wall Street that was the only thing that made the president hesitate to give him the position he'd so desperately wanted, Joe apparently told him that there was no need to worry, as most of his financial success did not stem from Wall Street, but rather from quote-unquote business acumen, as he phrased it. While this was de facto true, it was still more than obvious that the president didn't take this as an excuse. Neither did he want to. Instead, he explained to him that he wanted him as the chairman of the new Security Exchange Commission, which was at the time still only planned, as the necessary legislation, the Securities Exchange Act of 1934, was not yet passed by Congress. The time until the bill had been passed must have been arduous for Kennedy. He had no definitive promise of being chosen for the office. He knew he had quite a few rivals for the job, and he knew that Howe would probably try to block him with any means possible. His personal friendship to Raymond Moley, whose importance and influence grew by the day, and Felix Frankfurter, who always had the president's ear, properly influenced the choice. His strongest opponent, Ferdinand Pecora, had made a name as the head of the Senate's Committee on Banking and Currency and inquisitor of the many Wall Street bosses who had been brought to justice. Kennedy was invited to the White House on the 28th of June. After torturing the nervous aspirant for an entire evening at the dinner with his staff and friends, mentioning the topic not once but indulging in small talk, only at 2 o'clock at night did the president call Kennedy for a personal meeting. Toying a little with his nerves during the conversation, after some more meaningless chit-chat, Roosevelt told him that he had the job if he wanted to. As Kennedy respectfully mentioned all the opposition to his appointment as the chairman, given the entire "I made money off Wall Street" story, Moley, also present, broke the ice. "Joe, I know darned well that you want this job. But if anything in your business career could injure the president, this is the time to spill it. Let's forget the general criticism that you've made money off Wall Street." Moley continues in his memoirs. Joe reacted precisely as I thought he would. With a burst of profanity, he defied anyone to question his devotion to the public interest or to point to a single shady act in his whole life. What was more, he would give his critics, and here again the profanity flowed freely, an administration of the SEC which would be a credit to the country, the president, himself and his family, clear down to the ninth child. Given what we have heard during this season of the podcast, I would say that we could point to at least one shady act during his life. You may choose which. Whatever Roosevelt might have thought of the outburst, apparently playing with Kennedy's nerves amused him, he got the job. And the left wing of the party exploded. They rightly accused Kennedy of participating in the aforementioned glass scam, and were appalled by his career. Their calls remained unheeded. For the sake of digestibility of this podcast, I will continue to analyze Kennedy's activities as a chairman of the SEC for now, and leave the broader scope of family life behind. We'll come back to that in the next episode. Kennedy, with his old friend, and basically right-hand Eddie Moore, you might remember him from the first episodes as his chief of staff, quickly got to work. He bathed in the attention that his new position granted him. He rented the so-called Marwood, a huge quasi-villa outside of DC, for his personal quarters, and commuted to the SEC building daily. He dressed according to the newest fashion. He became an upper-class society member of the city. He organized his new commission like the Prussian General Staff. In a memo to all of his employees, he wrote, "The SEC is a government organization. Businessmen and the public have to deal with it, and they have a right to have everybody here during office hours, which are 9 a.m. to 5:30 p.m. Upon not being able to reach a few of his subordinates at 9 a.m. exactly, he wrote a second memo stating, "From now on, everybody must be at his desk at 9 precisely, unless he received my personal permission to the contrary." Joe found the stock market in a stagnating situation. It had always been infused with great amounts of private capital, since the American populace was used to investing money. This came from their great success in World War I war bonds, after which they simply continued giving a part of their earnings to stockbrokers and funds management. This led to a boom in deceivers and fraudulent stocks, especially through the recent crisis years, which caused people to lose their trust in the market. Kennedy quickly tried to tackle these problems. The so-called blue sky laws, dealing with stock market and financial transactions on state levels, were drastically redesigned. Joe and his team quickly began to regulate how much and what information was to be given to potential buyers. Furthermore, Kennedy addressed the nation on radio. "We of the SEC do not regard ourselves as coroners sitting on the corpse of financial enterprise. On the contrary, we think of ourselves as the means of bringing new life into the body of the security business. Can there be any doubt the government owes ordinary Americans the responsibility to check improper financial practices, that it owes this vast army responsibility to supervise the industry? The Commission will make war without quarter on any who sell securities by fraud or misrepresentation." These excerpts should already tell you that Kennedy meant business. The reaction to this radio address was overwhelmingly positive. Without a doubt, Kennedy's main objective was to restore confidence in the market. But Joe had a second, in no way less important function: the conservative, capitalist poster child for FDR's presidency. It was simple. The president was rather unscrupulous about his cabinet, and he made sure it was well staffed with loyal New Dealers, people who supported his idea of a strong state interventionism fully and were deemed socialists and revolutionaries by the conservative press. Whenever it was needed, Joe Kennedy was dragged into the spotlight, being photographed with the president or being announced as a key component in an important meeting. He was the perfect man for this job, as his reputation as a convinced capitalist and his rather substantial wealth took the wind out of the press's sails. The workload was immense. Kennedy and his staff were known to work up to 12 hours a day, every day. Literally every company offering stocks and securities had to be checked, registered and certified. New laws had to be drafted, basically one for every state of the Union, and circulation of hundreds of thousands of fraudulent bonds and stocks had to be stopped. Kennedy, however, proved to be a real asset to his agency. He really was the thief to catch a thief, as he precisely knew many of the dirty tricks and schemes that could be used to make money off Wall Street illegitimately. He, for example, prohibited the ping-pong trading used for artificially inflating the volume of traded shares, like he and his associates did with the glass companies back in '33. Furthermore, each state's blue sky law had to be adjusted to a general standard, a difficult enterprise given the relative weakness of the federal government concerning state laws. His great successes, for example the stabilization of the market in 1935, and even the small but consistent rise of the Dow Jones, quickly made Joe a valuable asset for the president. While still being acting chairman of the SEC, he was appointed to the executive committee for Roosevelt's $5 million relief fund, which was supposed to create new jobs for the American workers in January 1935. In a letter to Jack, he stated, "I don't know how in heaven's name I'm going to find any time, but I will stick out for as long as I can. It looks very doubtful, however, if I will be able to finish this job by the 1st of July, the deadline he had set for himself." Furthermore, he was the person who was mainly responsible for conveying the idea of the limited income of $1 million to his business friends, basically lobby work. This meant that any American who earned more than $1 million a year, of which only 42 existed by the time, were only allowed to keep this amount of their earnings and give the rest to the state. Indeed, he traveled to San Simeon, where William Randolph Hearst, one of those people, lived, and convinced him personally of holding fire against the government, while the president saved the country from communism by reforming the capitalist system. When the bill went to Congress, however, Hearst sent the following telegram to his editors. President's taxation is essentially communism. It is to be sure a bastard product of communism and demagogic democracy, a mongrel creation, which might accurately be called demio-communism, evolved by a composite personality which might be labeled Stalin Delano Roosevelt. Yikes. But this outrageous propaganda did not stop the president's agenda. Indeed, during the summer of that year, the Wagner Act did allow every worker to unionize, and Congress ratified the Public Utility Holding Act in June, after a furious propaganda battle starting in February. This act did force any public utilities companies, especially electricity companies, to limit their actions to a single state, subjugating them to this particular state's law. Any company which did not adhere to this law by January 1st, 1941, would be forcefully dissolved. While Kennedy managed to water down this death sentence, as he called it, into giving the SEC the right to decide about companies who failed to submit to this law, it did still cost him a lot of reputation with his business friends. On September 6th, 1935, the year of 12-hour days, 6 days a week, finally made Joe Kennedy, who was quite visibly exhausted and in over his head by then, submit his letter of resignation to the president. It is a matter of speculation to this day whether it was fatigue, or, as Kennedy later claimed, to regain face in front of his business colleagues, his disagreement with government actions. I really do not believe this to be true, since Kennedy had willingly and, as one has to admit, quite effectively served the Roosevelt administration in pushing through an agenda of market regulation and strong government ideas. His end result was an outstandingly good one. While being a respected individual in the Democratic Party from basically the start after his first successes, he was as much endeared to his opponents. On September 25th, the Wall Street Journal wrote, "He was more consistently and unanimously praised by the press than any public official of his time. Mr. Kennedy happened to be in a class entirely alone. He stood out among these giddy New Dealers and carefree money scatterers like a lighthouse in a fog." Whatever the reasons may have been, Kennedy left a government on a good way to re-election. Huey Long, the only real Democrat Roosevelt could expect to challenge his dominance in the party, pretty much because he had been an even more radical New Dealer than him, had been assassinated in Baton Rouge on September 10th, so Roosevelt had no real opposition against him in his own party. Still, the Republicans and their supporters had a lot of big businessmen and media tycoons on their side. There was, however, the White Knight who tried to tackle this problem for the president, Joe Kennedy. Even after his first political retirement, Kennedy kept his good relationship with the president via his family, especially via his old friend and business partner James "Jimmy" Roosevelt. So, when the campaigning season of 1936 began, Joe jumped on the train again, but this time on a full-time basis. He traveled the entire US over the course of the campaign, giving speeches in front of businessmen, media authorities, created lists of possible supporters in the upper class, and, maybe most importantly, wrote a book titled "I'm for Roosevelt." Unfortunately, I have completely missed out on getting one of the rather rare copies of this book, but as you can read in Nazor's biography of Kennedy, it was not a brilliant read anyways. In his rather dry work, he spoke out for the benefits of the Roosevelt presidency for business, nothing more and nothing less. As you might imagine, a book like this did not sell like warm bread in a society where poverty was still an issue for most of the unemployed workers, but the media coverage Joe and his book got, showing that the admired former head of the SEC still stood behind the presidency, probably did its part in rallying parts of the Wall Street elite behind the commander-in-chief. On November 3rd, 1936, Roosevelt had won 46 of 48 states. Only Vermont and Maine went with his opponent Alf Landon, with 61% of the popular vote and a whopping 523 out of 531 votes in the Electoral College. It is the greatest victory any president has ever won to this day. There was one person who had suffered defeat worse than anyone else: William Randolph Hearst. According to Nassau, he made his, quote, largely urban working-class Democratic readers to choose between him and the president, by attacking him with names like Moscow's comrade. As the people obviously chose Roosevelt, the already heavily indebted Hearst, perhaps one of the weakest financial managers in the history of big business, lost a significant part of his readers. He turned to Kennedy for help, and after Kennedy already had saved companies like RCA and Paramount from financial disaster simultaneously to his campaign actions, Kennedy helped him out with both money and financial and organizational know-how, repaying the debt from Roosevelt's first campaign 100 times over. Kennedy, although stating towards his friends and even Jimmy Roosevelt that he was out of politics for good, did of course expect an office in the new government. Well, maybe his fake cries of disinterest had been too loud. The newly founded United States Maritime Commission, responsible for a massive merchant navy building plan and organization of the American merchant navy sailors, needed a chairman. Kennedy accepted his task, maybe a little grudgingly, especially because he probably had eyed the post of Secretary of the Treasury again, so brilliantly administered by Henry Morgenthau. However, he was a well-known miracle worker in Washington, so he seemed to be an effective pick for the task. Being experienced in creating new government agencies from scrap, Joe quickly tackled the first problem of the shipbuilding industry: striking workers and seamen. Being a sailor on a US merchantman in this period was a terrible job. Pay was subpar, the conditions at sea were absolutely terrible, and the men had little or no vacation or options to leave the port cities when they were finally back in the US, while lots of them took ill on their journeys and never saw their homeland again. This of course led to a shortage of sailors, as in the recovering economy of the mid-30s many better paying jobs with better working conditions were available. Kennedy firstly focused on getting the sailors and shipbuilders back to work, and then reorganizing their recruitment and living conditions. How did he do that? By threatening the sailors with extreme punishment, going so far as allowing the captain of a mutinous ship in South America to put the mutinous seamen in irons, which happened to 14 of them. So Kennedy started a full-out war with the Union of Merchantmen Sailors. Rather fortunately for him, they resorted to insulting him personally, saying that they were going to get his scalp and other ghastly threats and insults. This significantly weakened their position, and Kennedy managed to win the public debate over the entire issue. His orders were deemed lawful by both public and jurisdiction, and he had demonstrated his power over the Union. Although he got a lot of praise for his work, which I do not really want to focus on right now because it does not add a lot to the Joe Kennedy story, Kennedy was not at all delighted with his position. According to Jimmy Roosevelt, Kennedy, quote, had made it clear after the 1936 election that he felt he deserved a reward, which he did, and he had hinted broadly that the reward he had in mind was the post of Secretary of the Treasury, which was out of the question. Father was not going to remove Henry Morgenthau from office. End quote. The point that Morgenthau was a Jew must have riled up Kennedy even more, as we will enlighten his stance on Jews a little more during the next episode. What he requested from Roosevelt instead was nothing less than preposterous. Again quoting Jimmy Roosevelt, "One evening Joe said if he could not be Secretary of the Treasury, there was one other job he'd consider. I'd like to be ambassador to England." I was surprised. I really liked Joe, but he was a crusty old cuss, and I could not picture him as an ambassador, especially not to England. Roosevelt, when first hearing about this, as Nassau writes, laughed so hard that he almost toppled from his wheelchair. With an effective but unhappy Kennedy in his Maritime Commission, Roosevelt, a year after Kennedy had made the informal request, intended to actually fulfill it. But this will have to wait until the next episode, when we will discover the great disaster of Joe Kennedy's political career, which in fact led to its end, being an ambassador to the United Kingdom. As a lot of you might have seen already, I have announced the topic of the next season of The Forgotten on all my social media outlets. The next person we will deal with is quite a controversial one, with many supporters and foes on both sides of the political spectrum. I'm talking about Salvador Allende, president of Chile from 1970 to 1973. Be sure to follow those outlets to get some more information about the next season. Recently, especially on Twitter, many history podcasters, spearheaded by the brilliant Pontifex podcast, go check it out, have encouraged their listeners to leave reviews on podcast distribution pages. I, with my rather limited amount of reviews, do support this notion wholly. There is nothing as exhilarating for a podcaster as reading a positive review, and nothing helps you grow like a well-structured criticism. So, I would like to ask any of you who listen to this episode on either Stitcher or iTunes to leave an honest review. One sentence is already more than enough, but feel free to write more. I wish you a good day or a good night. See you next time.